Monte Carlo, the last week of July, 1891. A little after 8 in the evening. A small, balding Englishman walks into the Salle Schmidt at the Casino de Monte Carlo. He is 50 years old. His suit is cheap. His accent, when he speaks, makes the croupiers wince. His name is Charles Wells, and the 4,000 pounds in his pocket do not belong to him. He borrowed it from a man who believed he was funding a machine that saves fuel. There is no machine. There has never been a machine. Wells sits down at the roulette table, buys in, and starts placing the smallest bets the table allows. The croupiers do not look twice. They have seen 100 men like him this week, alone. By 6 the next morning, 2 of those croupiers will be pushing a handcart of gold up the marble stairs because the building has run out of cash at his table. Not once, 11 times. And for the next 130 years, nobody will be able to explain how he did it. This is the story of the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo and of the question that outlived him. We are going to follow Charles Wells from a shipyard in Marseille, where he was once a real engineer, to a cramped office in London where he sold inventions that did not exist, to the most famous gaming room in Europe, and finally to a single rented room in Paris, where he will die owing 2 weeks of rent. Along the way, we will meet the Blanc family, who built Monte Carlo out of a swamp and ran it on one beautiful, merciless piece of mathematics, and who, when Wells beat them, made a decision no casino owner should ever make. And we will meet a woman named Jeanette, who appears in none of the headlines, and who stayed beside Wells through every disaster that was coming. Because there are 2 versions of Charles Wells. In one, he is the only man who ever solved roulette. In the other, he is simply the luckiest liar who ever lived. He spent the rest of his life refusing to say which version was true. He carried the answer with him into the ground. Charles DeVille Wells was born in Broxbourne, Hertfordshire, on the 20th of April, 1841. His father was a poet, a man so admired in his youth that John Keats once wrote him a sonnet. When Charles was a few weeks old, the family crossed the Channel and settled in France, first in Brittany, later in Marseille. And in Marseille, for one brief stretch of his life, Charles Wells was exactly what he would claim to be for the next 60 years. He worked as an engineer in the shipyards. And in 1868, he invented something real, a device for regulating the speed of a ship's propeller. He sold the patent for 5,000 francs, roughly 5 times his annual salary. It was the only thing he ever built that worked. He never invented another, but he kept the title. For the rest of his life, Charles Wells called himself an engineer. And engineers, the saying goes, do not believe in luck. What he sold after Marseille was not machines. It was the idea of machines. A musical skipping rope for children. A torpedo that would fire underwater and catch fish. A railway from Berck-sur-Mer to the coast. A device that regulated steam through music. None of them existed beyond the drawings. But the drawings were beautiful, the patents looked official, and Wells could talk. He had a method, and the method never changed. Find someone with savings, a widow, a retired officer, a shopkeeper. Show them the diagrams, promise them 20%, take the money to build the prototype, then vanish. By 1891, he had done this so many times, he was working under false names. One investor, a man named Cat, had handed him almost £19,000, close to $2 million in today's money, for inventions that were never made. Wells spent all of it on nothing. He was 50 years old. The fake addresses had stopped working. The investors were closing in, and arrest was weeks away. He had one move left. A few weeks earlier, a man whose name we still do not know had given Wells £4,000 for a fuel-saving device. It was the last money Wells would ever raise on a lie. He did not build the device. He bought a ticket to the south of France. To understand why what Wells did was supposed to be impossible, you have to understand the building he walked into. The Casino de Monte Carlo was, in 1891, the largest gambling operation in the world. It had been conjured out of nothing by a man named Francois Blanc, who took a malarial swamp on the Riviera in the 1860s and turned it into the gambling capital of Europe. By the time Wells arrived, Francois was dead, and his son Camille ran the house. The casino was built on a single number, 2.7%. That is the house edge on European roulette. On any one spin, it means almost nothing. Over 1,000 spins, it becomes gravity, inevitable, unbreakable. The Blancs understood this better than anyone alive, and so they did something that looked like generosity and was actually arithmetic. They let people win. They encouraged it. Every table opened each morning with a reserve of 100,000 francs, the bank. When a player won so much that the table's reserve ran dry, play stopped and a small ceremony began. The croupiers laid a black cloth over the table, like a shroud. The player had broken the bank. It was theater. By the next morning, the table was restocked, the mathematics resumed, and every newspaper in Europe had run the story of the man who beat Monte Carlo, which sold more train tickets than any advertisement the casino could buy. Most of the men in those headlines gave it all back within the week. The house had been broken before. In 1873, an English mill engineer named Joseph Jagger hired 6 clerks to record every spin of every wheel for weeks. He found one wheel with a worn bearing that favored a handful of numbers, bet only on them, and walked away with a fortune. The Blancs learned from Jagger. They began rotating the wheels between tables each night, recalibrating the bearings, switching the frets, hiring inspectors to hunt for bias. By 1891, they were certain. Their wheels were true. Their reserves were bottomless. Their mathematics was undefeated. And then a bald little Englishman with no money of his own sat down at one of their tables. He began the way every doomed gambler begins. Even money bets. Red, black, odd, even, small stakes. He won a little, lost a little, a normal pattern. 20 minutes passed. Then something started at his table that no one at Monte Carlo had ever seen. Wells stopped losing, not for a spin, not for a lucky run, continuously. He won on red, he won on black, he won on the columns. At one stretch, and this is the part historians still cannot explain, he won 23 out of 30 consecutive spins. On a fair wheel, the odds of that are roughly 1 in 10 million. Wells had spent his whole life insisting that engineers do not believe in luck. Watching him that night, you would have sworn luck believed in him. At one point, he placed his money on a single number, 5, and left it there. It came up. He left it. It came up again. Witnesses later swore the number 5 paid him 5 times in a row. By midnight, the table's reserve was gone. A croupier crossed to the cashier and whispered, The cashier opened a safe and brought out the secondary reserve. The chips were wheeled back. Within the hour, Wells broke it again. The casino's procedure for a broken bank was built to run once a month. The cashiers had never run it twice in a night, and now they were running it again and again. By the fifth time, 2 staff were hauling sacks of gold and franc notes up the marble staircase from the underground vault on a handcart. Wells did not move. He did not eat. He drank nothing stronger than water. He simply kept betting, sometimes shifting colors, sometimes doubling, sometimes pulling a wager back at the last second, with no system any croupier could write down. By 3 in the morning, the table was ringed 3 deep. The orchestra in the main hall had stopped because half its audience had drifted away to watch. Camille Blanc himself was sent for. He arrived in evening dress and stood behind the table, saying nothing, watching the mathematics he had inherited come apart. By 6 in the morning, Charles Wells had broken the bank 11 times. In 11 hours, he had won 1 million francs, several $1 million today, the largest single session in the history of the house. The croupier drew the black cloth across the table for the 11th time. Wells stood, picked up his cane, walked past Camille Blanc without meeting his eyes, and left. By the time the next train pulled out of Monte Carlo, there was a reporter on it. Within 48 hours, the story was on the front page of every major paper in Britain, France, and Germany. The man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. For Camille Blanc, the 1 million francs was not the problem. The problem was the threat underneath it. If Wells had found a system that genuinely worked, and the house could not explain how, then the 2.7% that everything rested on was a lie. So Blanc did what any rational owner would do. He hired investigators. Within a week, 2 private detectives were following Wells, where he ate, where he slept, who he met. They found nothing. No accomplices, no signals, no device. Reporters were sent to the floor to study his old seat and the wheels themselves. They wrote that they could detect no pattern at all in the way he placed his bets. Wells gave one interview, said only that he had perfected an infallible system based on mathematics and patience, and refused to describe a single part of it. Nobody believed him, and nobody could prove a thing. So Camille Blanc made a decision that, looking back, seems insane. He let Wells come back. In November of 1891, 4 months later, Wells returned to Monte Carlo, sat at the same table, and did it again. By the most reliable count, he broke the bank 6 more times. The Blancs let it happen because they had run a calculation the public had not. Every headline about Wells brought thousands of new gamblers through their doors. Every broken bank was advertising worth more than the francs he carried out. So the house did not chase him away. It put his face in its own promotional material. It mentioned him in interviews. The man robbing Monte Carlo was the best marketing Monte Carlo had ever had. But Camille Blanc was still watching. Because he remained certain, absolutely certain, that Wells had a method. A method, not a miracle. The house, like Wells, did not believe in luck either. And here's the strange thing. He may have been wrong. The man who looked most like a cheat may have been telling a different lie entirely. Here is where the legend wants to take you, and here is where it falls apart. The legend says Wells was Joseph Jagger all over again, an engineer, a man who watched the wheels for days with a notebook before he ever sat down, who found a worn bearing or a pocket cut a fraction too deep, who learned which numbers the flaw favored and bet only on those. It is a beautiful story. Engineers, after all, do not believe in luck. There is only one problem. It does not match how Wells actually bet. A biased wheel betrays itself through numbers. Specific pockets come up too often, and you exploit them by loading your money onto those pockets, spin after spin, for thousands of spins, until the small edge becomes a fortune. That is what Jagger did. That is the only way it works. But Wells did not bet specific numbers. He bet red and black. He bet odd and even. He bet the colors, which a biased wheel cannot help you with at all, because a worn bearing does not favor a color. It favors a slot. And on the single occasion he did fixate on one number, it was five times running, which is not the signature of a man exploiting a flaw. It is the signature of a man on the most absurd streak of luck in the history of the game. Everything that made Wells look like a genius is, on closer inspection, the fingerprint of pure chance. And everything that made him look like a cheat, his record, his lies, his refusal to explain, is the fingerprint of a con man who understood that a mystery is worth more than an answer. A century later, in the casinos of Madrid, a Spanish gambler named Gonzalo Garcia Pelayo did what the legend says Wells did. He sat for months. He recorded tens of thousands of spins by hand. He found the wheels that ran a millimeter off true, bet only the numbers they favored, and won a fortune. Then he did the thing Wells never did. He explained exactly how, in the open, on television, in print. The courts ruled he had broken no law because he had broken no wheel. He had only out-measured the house. Garcia Pelayo proved the engineer's dream was real. And by contrast, he proved what Wells was not. Wells left no notebooks. He named no wheel. He measured nothing. He bet on colors, won 11 times, and let the world assume he was the smartest man in Europe. The infallible system may never have existed at all. The greatest thing Charles Wells ever built may have been the rumor of it. While Wells was preparing a third trip to Monte Carlo, a music hall composer in London named Fred Gilbert was reading the newspapers about him. The bald little Englishman had been everywhere for months. Gilbert sat down at a piano and wrote a song. As I walk along the Bois de Boulogne with an independent air, you can hear the girls declare, he must be a millionaire. You can hear them sigh and wish to die. You can see them wink the other eye at the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. He sold it to a singer named Charles Coburn for £10. Coburn performed it in London, Paris, Berlin, New York, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Sydney. He sang it in 14 languages, by his own count, more than 250,000 times across his life. By the spring of 1892, it was on every accordion and in every pub from Glasgow to Naples, the most popular song of the decade. More than a century on, it is still in print. The chorus has, somewhere in the world, essentially never stopped. And Charles Wells, watching his own name become the most famous in Europe, was furious. Because Fred Gilbert never paid him a penny. He had become a legend, a marketing campaign, and a song. What he had not become since that November was a winner. In January of 1892, he returned to Monte Carlo a third time and lost 100,000 francs. He never broke the bank again. The money was running out, and the old life, the fake patents, the ruined investors, the false names, was finally catching up with the most famous gambler in the world. Wells made the calculation that would destroy him. He decided to spend the fame. He had a yacht built, an enormous one, with a ballroom that could seat 50, and renamed it the Palais Royal. He sailed it along the coasts of France and England, telling investors he was about to launch the largest steam shipping company in Europe, backed, of course, by his Monte Carlo fortune. They handed him money, a great deal of it. And Wells did what Wells had always done. He spent it. In late 1892, 2 French detectives boarded the Palais Royal in the harbor at Le Havre and arrested him on the deck of his own yacht. He was extradited to England and tried at the Old Bailey in March of 1893. The jury convicted him on 23 counts of fraud, 8 years in Portland prison. He served 6 years, released early for good behavior, though he once spent 2 days in solitary for giving a loaf of bread to another inmate. Shortly before his release, he sat at the organ in the prison chapel and played, of all things, the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. He came out in 1899, older, quieter, broke. And then, because the method never changed, he did it one more time. In 1910, under the name Lucien Rivière, he opened a small private bank in Paris and promised depositors 365% a year, 1% a day. It was the patent fraud again, dressed in different clothes. The old investors were paid out of the new ones. The whole structure stood only as long as the money kept arriving. 6,000 people put in their savings. 2 million francs. A decade before a man named Charles Ponzi would give this exact scheme its name, Charles Wells had perfected it. When the French police finally traced Lucien Rivière and arrested him in January 1912, the money was gone. 5 more years. He walked out in 1917, 76 years old, into a Europe that no longer remembered why his name had once been a song. There is one person in this story who never made the headlines. Through the yacht, the trials, the prison years, the second fraud, and the second prison, a much younger woman named Jeanette stayed beside Charles Wells. She was with him at the end in a single rented room in Paris, where the most famous gambler in the history of Europe lived out his last years with nothing. He died in July of 1922, owing 2 weeks of rent. When his body was prepared, the attendant searched his pockets and found not a single coin. He was carried back to England and buried in an unmarked grave. Jeanette could not afford a stone. He left her no fortune, no system, no answer. He left her the same thing he left everyone, a story that would not resolve. Because the question never closed. For 130 years, it has stayed exactly where Wells left it. Did a failed engineer beat the unbeatable mathematics of Monte Carlo 11 times in a single night? Or did the luckiest liar who ever lived simply walk into the right room on the right evening and let the world write the rest? The casino always said it was luck. Wells, to the day he died in that rented room, always said it was a system. He never described it. He never wrote it down. And there is the final cruelty of it. Charles Wells called himself an engineer for 60 years, and engineers, he liked to remind people, do not believe in luck. He built a musical skipping rope that never sang, a torpedo that never fired, a railway that never ran, a bank that ate the savings of 6,000 people. Every machine he ever made was a lie, except, perhaps, for one. Somewhere in 11 hours at a roulette table, the man who could not build anything that worked may have built the only thing that did, a way to break the largest casino in the world. And the only thing he ever made that worked, he never sold to a single soul. If you sat with this whole story, do one thing before you go. Tell us in the comments which Charles Wells you believe in, the engineer or the liar. We read them. The next story we are pulling back up was also buried on purpose. Subscribe and you will be there when it surfaces.